let's just remind ourselves as we're about to begin the last two chapters of the human condition, what the book is about. The book is about the vita activa, the active life, the life of action, which takes its meaning and import in opposition to the life of contemplation, the vita contemplativa. And there are a series of reversals that go on. One is the reversal of the ancient hierarchy in which contemplation was higher than action. And then there's the reversal within the vita activa itself, in which we move from the world, the external world, in a sense, to the internal world. Much of what we're reading about in this chapter on the vita activa and the modern age is that we are experiencing what Arendt calls world alienation. The secularization of the world doesn't throw us away from God back to the world, but throws us back upon ourselves. We seek certainty in ourselves in a kind of internalization, and this is for Arendt a deep, a profound threat to the human condition. Why to the human condition? Not to human nature, but to the human condition, because for as long as we've known the human condition has had various faculties, capabilities, that each had underlying them a certain condition. So it had labor, and underlying labor was the need for life, the condition that we had to live. It had work, and underlying the faculty or capability of work was the condition of permanence and stability in a common world. And it had the faculty or capability of action, and underlying action was the condition of plurality, namely that that there are many people, each with different views and different worlds and different experiences, and that we act by inserting ourselves into that world of plurality and seeing if we can find a common cause with other people. That's what politics is for Arendt. The last chapter, the whole last chapter, the vita activa and the modern age, is about, for Arendt, the way that the vita activa, these three main activities, labor, work, and action, develop and are challenged in the modern age, the age of science. And we've followed this along. The main developments here are the invention of the telescope, the development of processes, the internalization and the interiorization of thought and of the world. And what this means and the effect that this begins to have, as we discussed at the end of our last session in chapters 43, was that one of the core aspects of the modern age was the elevation of homo faber, the productive capacity of man to make the world, but that this capacity was still tied to the world. And insofar it was tied to the world, it was tied to interest and an external objective world of ends and objects that it made. And what she argues in chapters 42 and 43 is that even though we should expect homo faber in a sense to be victorious, it declines, and it declines because of all these different reasons that we've been discussing, science, process, interiority of the modern age. And now in section 44, she raises this question of life as the highest good again, but not because of philosophy, but she says it actually has a much more real and much more obvious reason that life, as opposed to stability, or labor as opposed to work, becomes the dominant and highest good in the modern age, and that's the hangover from Christianity. Christianity sets as its basic proposition that the human soul, the human life, is immortal, and the core thought of the human life, is the immortality of the soul and the preservation of that soul over and against the world, such that you will die in order to preserve your soul, even if the world be damned. And in the end, you care more about your soul and its immortal life than anything else in Christianity as she understands it. The loss of a belief in immortality and the rise of secularism doesn't turn us away from our individual life to the world. It turns us to the living life, our life in the world, as a living animal being, and it is our concern with our life that she says becomes the dominant and highest goal and activity of modern man in the modern age. And I'll just turn you to page 316, where she says in the middle of at the beginning of the first full paragraph, Christian emphasis on the sacredness of life tended to level out the ancient distinctions and articulations within the Vita Activa. It tended to view labor, work, and action as equally subject to the necessity of present life. It didn't elevate labor, work, or action as one necessarily higher than the other. It flattened them out. But quite importantly, and this is on page 318, at the bottom, she says, however that may be, the modern age continued to operate under the assumption that life and not the world is the highest good of man. In its boldest and most radical revisions and criticisms of traditional beliefs and concepts, it never even thought of challenging this fundamental reversal which Christianity had brought into the dying ancient world. No matter how articulate and how conscious the thinkers of modernity were in their attacks on tradition, the priority of life over everything else had acquired for them the status of self-evident truth. This is, for her, the core teaching of Christianity in the modern age, that life is the highest good. Why does that matter? It matters because the other highest goods for which we might live, immortality, justice, truth, etc., stand back behind life, and it means that we increasingly see both work and action, homo faber, and the active life as simply designed to keep us alive. And the result of that for Arendt is a flattening out of the active life, so that not only have we lost contemplation, we have also lost, for the most part, the life of creating and making, homo faber, and the life of action. That's the premise of section 44. So this is in the next section, chapter 45, the last section on the victory of the anima laborans, right? So this is the end. What has won? What is the kind of humanity that has emerged in the modern age. There was the inversion of the vita contemplativa being not replaced, but hierarchically replaced by the vita activa. And now within the vita activa, the victory of the anima laborans. There's a certain amount of review that we get on page 320 to 321, in which we're told that this mortal individual is filled with uncertainty, and he's deprived of immortality, right? Because there's God is dead, and we no longer believe in that, and Cartesian doubt. We live in an uncertain world, but we're not thrown into the world because we don't even know if the world exists. We're thrown increasingly into ourselves and back on our subjective and introspective ideas. And even then, we're not even thrown on ourselves. We're thrown back on this idea of processes, and we feel that we don't even know what we are. We know that we develop, that we emerge over time. In such a world, she says, what comes to dominate is the desire for the survival of the species. So if we look at page 321, and I'm going to get to Rosanille's question, which is a good question, but I just want to get there first. She says, we saw that before in the rise of society, it was ultimately the life of the species which asserted itself. So we no longer will focus on individual man and individual interests, but on the species. Why? Because in order to keep people alive, we need to feed everybody. We need to feed people. We need to house people. And so we employ statistics and numbers, and we develop sciences like sociology and anthropology that study mankind, and in studying mankind, try and determine how best to increase his chances of survival. And so she'll say in the middle of 321, the point is that now even the last trace of action in what men were doing, the motive implied in self-interest, disappeared. Right? So the point is, we're supposed to act not for our self-interest, but for the social interest. What does that mean? It means that we're supposed to rationalize our behavior. And this is what sociology and social politics is supposed to do. We're supposed to all act not for our self-interest, that's selfish, but for the societal interest. And what was left was simply a natural force, the force of the life process itself, to which all men and all human activities were equally submitted, and whose only aim, if it had an aim at all, was survival of the animal species man. None of the higher capacities of man was any longer necessary to connect individual life to the life of the species. We become part of man insofar as we rationalize our behavior so that we will survive. That basis, that foundation, then suggests that the higher activities of man, thought, art, work, and action, suddenly become superfluous, extra, not necessary. So she says thought itself becomes simply a reckoning with consequences. What are the consequences? If I do this, what will its effect be on me and the world and on other men? And we can increasingly give up our thoughts to electronic instruments that fulfill these functions better than we ever could. This is on 322 at the top. Action, she then says as well, also is exclusively understood in terms of making and fabricating, which are things I do as an individual. Only that making, because of its worldliness and indifference to life, is now regarded simply as something I do to make a living, namely to pay my bills. so that artists become part of the art market. And she then talks about the last stages of a laboring society, the society of a job holder. We are job holders. We are people who exist in order to hold jobs. When you go to a party or you go somewhere and you meet someone, they say, "How are you? What do you do?" That becomes who you are. And our laboring, job holding activity, in a sense, sets us, what she says, within an automatic functioning, as though individual life had actually been submerged in the overall life process of the species, and the only active decisions still required of the individual were to let go, so to speak, to abandon his individuality and still individually sensed pain and trouble of living, and the acquiescence in a dazed, tranquilized, functional type of behavior. This is an astounding line, but what she's saying here is the one individual decision left to most of us today in our bureaucratic, job-holding, life-oriented society is whether we participated in it or not. Do we, participate in the automatic functioning? You grow up, you go to school, you get a job, you live, you die. We have become submerged in this life process in which there's just very few choices of freedom left for most of us. And she says the only choice we have is, and this is maybe where Rhea's question came from, is, do we accept it or not? Do we become at one with this process? And increasingly, it's very hard to resist it. We live at a time in which, and this is what Arendt is talking about, while there are we can make little choices here or there, we basically are living in a world in which our life paths are sketched out for us largely in advance. And she then can write at the bottom of this paragraph, "It is quite conceivable that the modern age, which began with such an unprecedented and promising outburst of human activity, may end in the deadliest and most sterile passivity history has ever known." I do think this is what she has in mind, which is that we simply are following set patterns of behavior that are increasingly set and nuanced and remade. I'm looking for the right word and I'm not getting it. Are increasingly perfected by computer-aided scientists and specialists who make school as productive as it can so we can get a job, so we can live, so we can feed our family, so we can go on to the next step. This is what she calls the most sterile passivity the world has ever known, our history has ever known. We live, for her, largely driven by the one interest that we all need to conform to, which is to keep ourselves fed, housed, and alive. And she then says in this very dark sentence that follows it on 322, "But there are other more serious danger signs that man may be willing, and indeed is on the point of developing into the animal species, from which, since Darwin, he imagines he is to come. Namely, we are reverting back to being an animal from out of which we come. And if in the concluding we return once more to the discovery of the Archimedean point and apply it, as Kafka warned us not to man himself and to what he is doing on this earth, it at once becomes a manifest that all man's activities, watched from a sufficiently removed vantage point, would appear not as activities, but as processes." Namely, and you see this all the time, the thing I love is when you watch the newspaper and they have these little maps of a country or the world with all the little lines going of where people traveled on Thanksgiving, right? The point is, looked at from afar, from way out in some sort of a universalist point of view, we just become data points on the map of human behavior. And as we become these data points, we can be predicted. Now, not each individual per se, maybe, not yet, but this is the hope, of course, of the big data society, which is that we will be able to predict human behavior, but not only predict it, improve it, better it, and that this is the dream that we are all complicit in, but also angstful of and worried about. That as we increasingly give our medical data and our personal data to the cloud, because it will make us safer and healthier, which we want, we increasingly lose the spontaneity to act freely that Arendt sees as essential for humanity. We essentially submit our individual interests to the overarching one interest of society, which is health, safety, security, and in doing so, lose the plurality that for Arendt makes up the condition of human action. And these are her fears. The exceptions she then thinks about, right? And this is what Rosa Mill was asking about. She mentions at least 3 exceptions to people, to groups of people in the modern era, modern age, I should say, who to a certain extent escape this reduction to the one interest of society. The first could be the artists, right? So this is on page 323. And it's important to realize, to take these words to heart. Needless to say, this does not mean that modern man has lost his capacities or is in the point of losing them. And I want to just emphasize this so it's not misunderstood. She's not saying we've lost our ability to act, we've lost our ability to think, we've lost our ability to make art or to create works. Not saying that at all. What she is saying is, no matter what sociology and economics and these social sciences tell us, right, men persist in making, fabricating, and building. We still do works. We are homo faber. Although, and this is the scarier line, although these faculties are more and more restricted to the abilities of the artist, so that the concomitant experiences of worldliness escape more and more the range of ordinary human experience. What's being said? Simply, very few of us will ever make something that lasts. Very few of us have the ability or the desire to make something that lasts. Most of us spend our time simply living, working, job holding, raising kids, etc., contributing to what she calls the reproductive species life, the biological species life of man. That doesn't mean we don't have the capacity for it, but fewer and fewer people will create something that lasts. Now you might say, well, most people didn't in history, and you know, there's a lot of truth to that. But you know, you would build a house and it would last generations. At least that was the idea. Today, you know, houses are disposable. The first thing most people seem to do when they buy a house is tear it down if they have the money to do so. And so the idea is that increasingly the people who preserve things and hold on to things are artists. She then has this footnote about art that we can talk about if you like, where she says that the fact that art is becoming subjective is not a problem as long as the subjectiveness is not expressiveness. Because as long as it's abstract and objective and seeks to say something about the world and last, it is still art. It still is about permanence. We can talk about that if you'd like. The second group of people that she mentions that are in some way still making use of their capacities for non simply living are the scientists. Because what scientists do, and this is what Rosa Mill was talking about, is release processes into the world that can radically change the world forever. I don't know how many of you followed the meeting that happened in Washington, D.C. This week. Everyone's been talking about the meetings in Paris about climate change, but the scientists from a number of countries met in Washington, D.C. this week and came up with new rules and procedures for to what extent we can edit genetic information in human beings. And where they drew the line, they said it's fine to edit the genes and change the genetic structure if you're doing so for health purposes, but only insofar as the genetic structures you change are not in the reproductive organs. Why? Because if you change the genetic structures in the reproductive organs, you'll set whole new genetically artificial humans into the world through reproduction. So what the scientists said is that for now, they're going to allow genetic editing, but not allow genetic editing that will have that will exist in perpetuity through reproduction. But the point is, they said, we'll come back to that in a couple of years when we're better at it, and we'll have another decision. That's just one example of what Arendt is here talking about with scientists. They can change things like our genetic code or our atmosphere in ways that will have enormous impacts on the world we live in for generations, if not for forever. And what she says is these scientists have become the people who actually act in the world in a meaningful way. And the irony that she talks about, that Rosa Mill mentioned, is that we usually think of scientists as the people who are the least practical and least political members of society, who simply do what they can and what the science allows. And in a certain way, they're the only ones left who know how to act, and even act in concert, as this scientific meeting in Washington, D.C. this week suggests. And then finally, the third group, and it's the smallest, it seems, of the three, of people who still hold on to their non-simply living capacities, are what she calls the thinkers. And this is on 324 to 325. She says, thought, finally, which we, following the pre-modern as well as the modern tradition, omitted from our reconsideration of the vita activa, is still possible and no doubt actual wherever men lived under the conditions of political freedom. As long as we live in an age in which why is political freedom important? Because there's plurality. And the next line, she says, in a tyranny, right, no other capacity is as vulnerable as thought. Because in a tyranny, if the entire society pursues one interest and we share our interests, we lose plurality. Plurality is not just the condition for action, it's also the condition for thinking. And thus she can write, as a living experience, thought has always been assumed, perhaps wrongly, to be only known to the few. And then she ties thought to action. And so thought and action are for her both grounded in the condition of plurality. Thought is a kind of action emerging out of plurality that is open to the many. And so action is action grounded in plurality, open to the many, whereas thought may be open to a smaller group. She at least raises that. And she worries that it's an even smaller group today than it has been in the past. And then she ends with the citation from Cato: "Never is he more active than when he does nothing. Never is he less alone than when he is by himself," claiming that thinking is not opposed to activity, but thinking is an activity. And it is an activity that can only exist amongst plurality, and thus in conditions of political freedom. The great worry to which her book and much of her work is dedicated and is a response is that in the rise of society, in the rise of one interest, and thus the interest of a totally coherent society around keeping people alive, which is another word for totalitarianism, political freedom and thus thought and action will cease to be. She's not saying that has happened. She's not saying it will happen. But she is, as she is throughout this book, suggesting that the many of the conditions for totalitarianism and for the victory of animal laborans are amongst us and are deeply ingrained in our philosophy and in our political and cultural ways, and that we need to think deeply about whether we are going to resist these tendencies, which doesn't mean deny them, doesn't mean simply say, oh, well, we're not going to do that, because they are deep tendencies that in many ways are happening and are unstoppable as tendencies. But that doesn't mean we can't become aware of them, and in becoming aware of them, resist them. And this is her understanding of what comprehension is. It is the unpremeditated and attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. That's how she understands it in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I think that is what this book is an attempt to do, is to comprehend the threat to the human condition, in which the vita activa is plural through contemplation, action, thought, labor, and work. And her worry is that that plurality of human life, the plural conditions of plural human capacities, is disappearing, and we need to contemplate it, think it, face up to it, and if possible, resist it.